Hello to those who are just joining. Welcome to week 7 of the Implementation Science Reading course. I'm watching the participant ticker and it looks like it's slowing down a bit. So I think we can start to introduce our speakers. I'm delighted to welcome you to this week's topic and course. This is actually a new addition to the Implementation Science Reading course based on the feedback from last year's course, where there were some questions from folks about kind of putting everything together. So we got a lot of great feedback about people really enjoying the time spent on barriers and facilitators, what we call contextual determinants, implementation strategies, implementation outcomes, and all the specific pieces, but there were questions about how to bring it all together. And so we had Dr. Dennis Lee and Dr. Corey Bradley, two superstars from the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science, volunteer to take this forward and add a new part of the curriculum focused on implementation process and design, which will really help to synthesize what we've been talking about for the last several weeks. I'm very appreciative to both of them for taking the time to add this to our curriculum, and I'm going to turn it over to the two of them to get started. And I think we hear from Dr. Bradley first, but he can correct if I'm wrong. All right, take it away.
That's it. Thank you, Sarah. You introduce us like, we're rock stars, so that feels fantastic. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us in week 7. Really excited to be have advanced in the course with you all, and I'm sure you're gaining a lot from the discussions and the courses. Our agenda today we'll proceed with thinking around equity and research design, which is I appreciated Dennis, the conversation between Dennis and I to talk about, sometimes you tag on the end or kind of think about those considerations, but I think it's really cool for us to think about starting with that kind of intention. And then we'll talk a little bit about the implementation process, how we would study that given our designs, and the ways that we can deal with this time gap that you hear so much about and speed up implementation. And then we'll move into group discussions. And I'm really excited. Dennis is providing mentorship to me as an early faculty. And so a lot of this conversation today, he'll be leading, and then I'll be in the discussion to try to situate some of those ideas. So really looking forward to that. We can get the next slide. Our objectives include describing the core components of external validity and their relevance to D&I research, and this kind of consideration of internal and external validity when it comes to implementation research focused on real-world application. And so external validity becomes important. We want to identify common measures and analytic strategies that might be relevant for your research questions, and then describe how to frame and analyze the context with this complexity of interacting parts. So this is a slide that has more in it than anything, just as the statement, kind of both an aspiration and a particular path of my work to look at health equity and consider health equity as a driver of research and design and implementation science, appreciating that the work that we do in implementation research is about knowledge production. And so how do we ground that, that consideration in choosing research and design? Next slide, please. So I want to bring you back to the bridge, and those of you who are music heads understand that. Take me to the bridge. You saw this much earlier. And implementation science has been defined as what we do, so to speak, to bridge between what we know and our practice. And if you look at that D&I science bridge, you see all of the gaps that are subsumed, that the bridge seeks to overcome. And generally, I ask the question, can implementation science be about anything other than equity when we consider the 17-year delay and that interventions are not implemented among populations, particularly populations needing them the most? So you think about what is at risk in this gap, and Dr. Kamara Jones talks about the waste of race in racism, that there's a waste of human potential, the waste of important resources, if you think about it, including time and taxpayer resources, even our low income or no income tax payers, folks who are not receiving the full benefits of the innovations that we develop. So this work and the study, this is kind of my motivational talk, maybe, to say that we want to make sure that our research is paying attention to the societal benefits of health innovations for even the most disenfranchised. And there's a really great book I would recommend if you haven't read it. I don't know if you can see it well. Research is Ceremony, about indigenous research methods. And one of the things that they say is that methodology is part of the paradigm, is a part of the paradigm that guides the research and is based on the assumptions of ontology and epistemology. So just an idea to be very intentional about your epistemology and ontology. Next slide, please. A few ideas, just and I won't read those, I'll let you kind of peruse those with your eyes. Some ideas that support that it's really important how we integrate ethical values and root our work in these kinds of values and the choices that we make regarding research design, how they are connected to values and expectations in our resources. And I love this quote by Fred Turner around design as a process by which the politics of one world become the constraints on another. So the way that we design the choices that we make with regard to how we study a particular phenomena and how that phenomena is framed has implications for the kind of realities that folks experience, those be it ones that are disenfranchising or those that are empowering. So that's just a little more on the import of what we bring to design choices. Next slide, please. So implementation science has great potential to improve the health of communities. I hope we've made that argument. And individuals who are not achieving health equity. And so the question becomes, how can we use this enterprise of knowledge production situated within our disciplinary field to promote just and equitable health outcomes? And looking at the work from Castillo and Harris, they talk about some of the domains that may be important to consider when you're thinking about research design. Does the design allow for participatory approaches and research partnerships? And that kind of links to what our colleagues talked about in our previous session. And how does the design enable the engagement of diverse community stakeholders and interdisciplinary partnerships in defining and studying the problem? The age-old consideration about recruitment, representativeness, and generalizability. And we pose a question even about generalizability. Is it a matter of generalizability? Is it a matter of the local context, which I think are probably artificial binaries, but it's important to just think about that in the design, who's included, who's excluded in the considerations of study. And then intervention design being inclusive of the implementation strategy that is designed, as well as how that study is to be conducted, and to just kind of think about what is the level of participation and engagement and insight that is brought to that, and how are our partners in the implementation process, with implementation being a collective enterprise and a collaborative enterprise involved in interpretation and contextualization of our findings. And finally, to not be forgotten, the D of the D&I, right? The dissemination of those research findings and establishing what is that anticipated and actual community benefit. So we consider explicitly determine those kinds of considerations. Our next slide, please. So I'll hand it off to Dennis and he'll rocket us.
Thank you so much, Corey. And really what I think what Corey was telling us is the kind of bigger level pictures of things to keep in mind when we are designing our studies, choosing our partners, and conducting our research. So now I'm going to take it from the considerations down to how do you actually go about and start planning out a research study for yourself. But before we can talk about researching implementation, we really need to talk about how to implement. You have to walk before you can run. So I'm going to quickly go through implementation process. And luckily, we're going to review week 2 because we have these theories, models, and frameworks, a whole category of them that tells us how to implement this category of process models that specify the steps, stages, and phases in the process of translating research into practice. They describe and guide the process of translating research into practice. So essentially, these are the how-tos of what we need to do. And we can use these models to guide us in a stepwise fashion. Now, one of your readings was about the Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment Framework, or EPIS. This is one of the most popular process models out there, and at a very high level, you go through these 4 phases and move from trying to put something into place, a new thing into place, to sustaining it in that location. Now, each of these phases, you can see this is very high level. Each of these phases may involve numerous strategies to get you to the next phase, but at least you begin to see how you need to start ordering your strategies. For example, getting strategies to get people on board with your project, like marketing, like partnership building, which ties back to the last session in week 6. Those are primarily going to be used in your exploration phase and likely not as helpful when you're in full implementation. Likewise, if you're doing a lot of coaching, that's probably going to be more helpful in your implementation phase, but not so much when you're just exploring whether or not the thing is even a good fit. And so what the process models, even at the high level ones, tell you is what you should be doing and when, which is the key. Now you might be thinking, wait, what was that? Because these are the figures that were in the paper. So surprise, EPIS is also a determinants framework. It's actually hybrid determinants and process. And what you probably saw from the reading is that there's a lot of overlap with CFR. And one of the advantages over CFR that EPIS does have is, again, telling you about the timing of which determinants are important at what stage. So you can design strategies, particularly on this figure on the right, you can design strategies to target those specific determinants at those different stages, and depending on where you are in the process. Just to give you a quick example of another process model that's fairly popular in the literature, this one's called the stages of implementation completion. If you line it up with EPIS, you'll see that it is very similar. You have a pre-implementation phase, which kind of covers both exploration and preparation in EPIS, and then you have an implementation phase, and then you have sustainment. But it does, this model kind of breaks it down into a little more fine-grained pieces. So you start with engagement, you move into determining feasibility, you start planning for, and then getting ready to implement. So once you enter implementation, you're hiring your staff, you're monitoring your fidelity, you're doing consultations, you're providing ongoing services until you reach a level of competency and sustainment within the context in which you're implementing. So now that we have a decent idea of how we go about this process, how do we now research this process? And here's where we start talking about study designs, and including kind of the high-level considerations that Corey was talking about in the beginning. Your choice of partners, your choice of study population can determine how applicable or generalizable your findings are going to be. There are a number of other considerations for study design choice, like what is your specific research question? What type of evidence do you actually need to put forward to contribute to the literature? And on what levels do the strategies and the evidence-based intervention operate? Now, this is not going to be a full study design course. You can take a full graduate level course about that. So we're going to talk about things that are pretty high level. For the second one, what type of evidence do you need? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. If you do need effectiveness data, that's going to steer you towards hybrid studies. So that's just a preview for where we're going. And on the levels in terms of the levels, implementation research is inherently multi-level because you have agencies or context, and then you have providers within context, and then your kind of patients or clients within those. And so that has a lot of implications for sample size, as well as the types of analyses that you have to do. There's a lot of clustering and correlation, interclass correlations involved. We won't get into those details today. I am going to use, kind of going back to EPIS, I'm going to use EPIS as a way to start thinking about design. So kind of crossing process with research design. So starting with exploration, you can tell I did a not a great chop job on the, or a cropping job on the image, but we're going to move with that. The first thing, we're going to revisit this, the subway map. Typically, in the exploration phase, you are doing qualitative or mixed methods contextual inquiry. And that mirrors the subway map that we've seen in the past, mixed method studies to understand the context. What that might look like, you can do observational work or ethnographic work to understand what's happening in your contexts and figuring out what the needs are. You can do mixed methods work with interviews and focus groups, surveys with individuals. You can do chart reviews, you can do administrative data. These are just all examples of data sources that you can use for this stage of exploration when you are at the beginning stages of implementing and trying to figure out what you need to study in this phase. There's also the possibility to do a post design of an implementation strategy on adoption. And this is something that the Hendricks-Brown paper talked about. For example, if you had some sites and you use some exploration strategies here, you can then measure kind of that adoption decision, whether or not these sites ended up adopting the thing that you want to put into place. And this is something that I do in my own work. I'm working with the Chicago Department of Public Health with a number of HIV care agencies. We're running a learning collaborative, and hopefully at the end of the learning collaborative, we see that the agencies that participated will have adopted a new model of care. So this is all in the exploration phase. No one is implementing anything at this point, but this is another research design, within site design that you can use in exploration. Moving into preparation, here, this phase is much more about getting ready to implement. So there's not a ton you do in terms of your traditional research studies, but it is where you're designing your implementation strategies for use in the subsequent implementation phase. So we've talked about this during the strategies week session, but there are a number of different methods that you can use to select or design or tailor your strategies. They involve concept mapping, group model building, conjoint analysis, intervention mapping, user-centered design. All of those are different methods, not quite research designs, but methods you can use in this phase to design your implementation strategies. Quickly moving then into implementation, once you have your strategies, now from the research perspective, you want to test whether or not they work. And the big questions to think about here are you just observing like a natural experiment? Is something happening in the real world and you can just observe whether that some natural strategies being used are going to change implementation? Or are you manipulating? Are you actually externally going in and adding strategies to the contexts that you're studying? The other big question here is whether to randomize or not. And this depends on a lot of factors. Your agencies may or may not be okay with being randomized to certain things. Oftentimes in implementation research, there is not necessarily equipoise. You don't want to, you can't just have a non-control arm that doesn't get anything new. And so there are a lot of considerations around randomization that we won't get into details today, but we can talk about more in the discussion groups. We're going to run through a couple of the things, the designs that Hendricks-Brown talked about in his paper. These within site designs really answer the question, does introducing the strategy improve implementation outcomes within a set of sites that get the same strategy? So you could have one site or multiple sites. We're going to group them together because they're all getting the same strategy. And so kind of as I showed you in the exploration phase, you can have sites, you put in strategies, and then you measure the outcomes. Of course, a stronger design would be to do a pre-measure as well. So you can find the same sites, you can measure beforehand if you, for example, if they have a baseline level of reach, implement your new strategies, and then you can measure if that has changed reach or not at all. You can also use a within site design to look at whether the same strategy changes implementation outcomes in different contexts. So you have, again, sites, you measure, you implement your strategies, but then you measure again. But this is still considered a within site design because you're primarily looking at, because all of the sites are getting the same strategy. Then there's a whole level of between site designs. This is the only slide I have on that. Between site designs answer the question of which implementation strategy improves the implementation outcomes better. And here you can consider usual care as a second implementation strategy. So maybe the top level, the white level of strategies, that's usual care. And you have similar sites, but now you're implementing a different strategy. So the main question and answers is whether your new strategy improves implementation outcomes over your usual care, or if you had a head-to-head trial with two different strategies that you wanted to implement. Then Hendricks Brown goes on to talk about within and between designs, and here is in these types of designs, including step wedges and rollouts, what you're doing is you're randomizing potentially or matching and assigning sites to strategies and to different cohorts of time. And so what you end up with is you're able to have both within site comparisons as well as between site comparisons, because you at any point in time you'll have some sites getting one strategy, some sites getting a different strategy. These are very complex to run. We had a lovely speaker come in yesterday talking about step wedge trials. They are very complex to run, fairly resource intensive in terms of managing all of these different steps, but they drastically allow you to increase power in implementation research. When typically, if you're looking at a site level, you don't have that many sites to move around or manipulate. On the right-hand side is a variation of step wedge, or a variation of within and between, excuse me, called a rollout design. The difference really between step wedges and rollout designs is you don't have the full triangle. You're not measuring that much baseline, and you're not measuring that much kind of post-implementation. I'm going to switch gears really quickly and now talk about hybrid effectiveness implementation study designs. We've mentioned this a couple of times throughout the reading course, and they are often referred to as designs, but they're not true research designs. They are really, when you talk about hybrid studies, it's really a description of your aims. Are you looking for effectiveness data, or are you looking for implementation data? Again, kind of what type of evidence are you needing? There are a number of manuscripts that have come out about hybrid studies, one of which you read, the Landis et al. Paper. But to summarize a little bit, why are we doing, or why do we keep pushing hybrid studies in implementation research? Part of it is we really want to hurry up the process. Instead of the typical translational pipeline where we do efficacy research, then effectiveness research, and then maybe another effectiveness study, before you do implementation research, doing hybrids and getting data at both effectiveness and implementation data at the same time saves time in the long run around that pipeline. So you don't have to always wait for that perfect effectiveness data before moving into implementation. Another thing that hybrids can do is it backfills effectiveness data. So if you are in a context and there's a lot of political will and you're starting to implement stuff, but you're not 100% sure that is going to be the most effective thing to use, you're able to still continue to collect effectiveness data and backfill that effectiveness data even while you're implementing. And then the intervention outcomes allow you to kind of, because you're looking at both intervention outcomes as well as implementation outcomes, you can do analyses to help you figure out how those relate to each other. Very briefly, there are three types of hybrid study designs again. The hybrid type 1 is the most closely related to effectiveness research. And here your main aim or your main goal is to test your intervention, and then you're going to gather some information about implementation. So Oftentimes, this is seen as person-level randomized controlled trials of an intervention, very similar to a traditional effectiveness study, but you're going to add implementation-focused either process evaluation or mixed methods or evaluate the or to assess, barriers and facilitators, those types of things. So you're just tacking on a little bit of implementation to your hybrid, to your effectiveness study. On the flip side, your hybrid type 3 is going to be much more closely related to an implementation study. So you're really testing the implementation strategy using the various designs that we just went through. And you might still be gathering some information about intervention effectiveness. So oftentimes, or many times, this shows up as a cluster randomized control trial of the strategy, and you're using a lot of administrative data, oftentimes trying to avoid primary data collection of effectiveness data, but using kind of administrative or other types of surveillance data to get a hint about effectiveness as well. And here's where you'll see a lot of the step wedge rollout designs coming out. Hybrid type 2s are a little bit tricky because you end up having two primary aims in your study. You want to test the intervention as well as test the implementation strategy simultaneously. And so you have to put into place some safeguards in case your implementation strategy doesn't work so well and you don't want to lose your effectiveness aim piece as well. So you might have dual randomization as one version of a hybrid type 2 that we see in the literature. And another version of that is kind of a pilot of implementation strategies with still a primary, like a very heavy emphasis on person level effectiveness randomization. There's a lot about hybrids that have, or thinking around hybrids that have changed over the last 10 years that they have been kind of out and about. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more, this paper on kind of reflections on the 10 years of effectiveness implementation hybrid studies that came out in 2022. And for time, I'm just going to go over one of the case examples that we have, primarily because this case example, it comes from a real world example, and then the other one was a little more synthetic. But our case example of screening and brief intervention for risky drinking was a study in 10 pediatric trauma centers in 10 different health systems. Again, this is what we've looked at over the last couple of weeks. Here is the IRLM for that case study. So through our process, we have identified the innovation, which is screening and brief intervention. We have looked at barriers and facilitators through our contextual inquiry. I've identified the implementation strategies that we want to use to address those barriers and facilitators, and we have identified outcomes by which we want to see changes in implementation. The IRLM itself does not tell you very much about research or study design, so it is a complement to designing the study. It tells you kind of about all the components, but not necessarily how you're studying it. And in a study led by Dr. Becker, MIMIC2, they used a rollout design, which is pictured here, to study how these implementation strategies changed these implementation outcomes. And they set it up in a way where each cohort, sites were assigned to 3 different cohorts. I believe there's 12 sites, so 4 each. So each one went through a preparation phase, did some implementation, and then there was a lot about studying for sustainment. Whereas these gray boxes were the usual care or the waiting period before implementation started. And so the way that, to get you a closer look at how this looks and how the strategy is laid out, this diagram shows you in the preparation phase, there was didactic training, there's performance feedback and facilitation. So these strategies were used at kind of this point in time. Then when they moved into implementation, they used different sets of strategies. again, getting back to how implementation process and implementation strategies really tie together. And then some strategies were continued into the system phase. All right, that was a lot to take in. Somehow I always end up with the lectures that have the most content, but hopefully that gives you a lot of food for thought for your discussions. And I think we have some announcements that I'm going to pass over to Sarah to give as well.
Thank you so much. There was one question in the chat, and I didn't know if you wanted to answer that now or if you'd like the groups to reflect on this in the small group discussion. The question was from Ashley Knapp and acknowledged likely depends on the project, but is there general advice on how many sites might be needed for hybrid study types?
Ooh, for hybrid study types, I think in short answer is it always depends. And in part, it's because if you're doing a hybrid type 3, you're going to be focused mostly on testing your strategies, and you're going to, because you won't have a lot of sites to play with necessarily, you're going to have to figure out how to power on very small numbers of sample size. Whereas if you're on a hybrid type 1 side, this is much more closely related to your effectiveness study, usually at a patient, participant, client level. So your sample size is going to be much larger. You can power your primary analyses on that. So it depends a lot on the type of hybrid you're doing, as well as the number of, and therefore your sample size.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So as Dennis noted, we do have some announcements. CDIS and MSS, as part of recognition of the new MSS Division of Implementation Science, has been hosting a methodological implementation science lecture series. We had a fantastic lecture from Kate Rendell a couple weeks ago. Today, JD Smith is lecturing at noon, and there is a hybrid option or a virtual option for those that would prefer to join virtually. And then in a few weeks from now, we'll have Danny Almiral also coming to give a methodological talk. And then this Thursday is the IFAM Population Health Forum. It's all morning in Simpson Quarry. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. But you can come and see a range of fabulous posters. It's a great time for networking, and there's a wonderful plenary speaker speaking at noon. And I'd like to note that 2 implementation scientists are finalists for the Best of IFAM Annual Poster Award, our own Amy Van Pelt from CDIS, and then Callie Walsh-Bailey. So congrats to both of them. And if you attend, keep your fingers crossed that an implementation scientist takes it home this year. All right, I think we're going to break into our small groups. And I just want to again thank Dennis and Corey for pulling this together. It was a really informative talk.